The Japanese aircraft carrier Kaga did not die from water, she died from fire. On June 4, 1942, dive bombers from the USS Enterprise struck her with multiple bomb hits, at least 4, shattering elevators and punching down into the interior spaces below the flight decks. The detonations triggered secondary blasts from stored munitions and fed an inferno that damage control could not contain. For hours, the crew fought a losing battle in heat and smoke that turned hangar steel into a furnace. 811 men would die in the catastrophe. When the end finally came, it was a decision, not an accident. Later that day, the destroyer Hagikaze scuttled the burning wreck with 2 torpedoes. Kaga went down by the stern first, then vanished into more than 3 miles of water. Today, the wreck lies at a depth of roughly 17,700 feet, inside a federally protected marine monument near Midway. But the ship that rests there is not the ship that left the surface. To understand Kaga as she exists now, we must understand the violence of her descent and her arrival on the seabed. The physics of a deep ocean landing are governed by impact, breakup, and burial in fine sediment. At this depth, the bottom is not rock, it is soft abyssal deposit, silt, and biological detritus, capable of swallowing structure when heavy steel arrives at speed. Modern surveys show Kaga upright and embedded in the seafloor sediment, with portions of the hull partially buried and a debris field scattered nearby. She is held in place by the friction and weight of the seabed itself. Amidst this massive structural trauma, we find a stubborn anomaly. Logic suggests thin, exposed structures should be among the first to fail during descent, breakup, and bottom impact. Yet on the starboard side, a remnant of the exhaust uptake remains attached, an unexpectedly fragile survivor. It becomes a reference point. If this sliver endured, then everything around it was not merely damaged, it was erased. Fire weakened the ship before she ever sank. The fall finished the work. What sits upright in the dark is not a carrier in the familiar sense. It is a stripped body, hull and guns, its flight deck and island taken by separation, drag, and impact. To understand why the flight deck is missing and why the hull is crushed, we must look at what happened during the descent itself. The impact with the bottom was the end of the journey, but the damage began long before she hit the mud. The ocean deep is a hostile environment that does not negotiate with watertight compartments. 17,700 feet, more than 3 miles of water stacked directly on the wreck. Down here, the ocean stops being a maritime setting and becomes a pressure system. Sunlight dies early, temperature falls toward freezing, but the defining force is hydrostatic load, pressure rising with depth until the outside world becomes a uniform, omnidirectional weight. At this depth, any trapped air becomes a liability. If sealed voids remained, pressure differentials would punish them. But Kaga's silhouette is better explained by a chain of plane forces. Fire and internal blasts weaken the frame. Water entry and descent loads tear away upperworks. Lighter structures separate and drift. Impact and burial finish what gravity began. What sonar sees is the heavy body, capital ship hull, with much of the carrier's lighter architecture gone. The result is a wreck that looks less like an aircraft carrier and more like a ruined fortress. The upper hangars are gone. The bridge structure is gone. What remains is the heavy steel of the original Tosa-class battleship hull, which was strong enough to survive the fall. However, even this heavy armor shows signs of the crushing depth. The hull plating is warped and buckled between the structural frames, creating a ribbed effect often called the hungry horse look. This is the signature of a vessel that has succumbed to the deep, hostile environment. Yet amidst this massive structural violence, small details survived because of their density. We see this clearly in the survival of the roller blocks for the 5-inch guns. These are mechanical components used to traverse the weapon. Unlike the hollow hangars or the sealed void spaces, these blocks are solid metal. They contain no air pockets to compress. Because they are solid, the pressure acts on them uniformly without creating a differential. They sank 3 miles without deformation, sitting perfectly preserved on a deck that has been stripped of almost everything else. The Kaga is now a collection of dense survivals stripped of her lighter skin, a crushed shell in absolute darkness. At that depth, cameras are a second-stage tool. First, you must locate an anomaly without seeing it. The search was not a hunt for metal, it was a hunt for patterns in noise. To find a wreck here, you begin with sound. The primary tool for this kind of localization is side-scan sonar. This technology works by towing a sensor sled, also known as a tow fish, through the water column just above the seabed. The sensor emits pulses of high-frequency sound waves outward in a fan shape perpendicular to the direction of travel. When these sound waves strike a hard object like a steel hull, they bounce back to the sensor. When they hit the soft mud of the abyssal plain, they are absorbed or scattered. The result is an acoustic image that resembles a photograph made of sound. Hard objects appear as bright highlights, while the area behind them remains dark, creating an acoustic shadow. By measuring the length of this shadow, engineers can calculate the height of the object protruding from the mud. The search team drives the ship in parallel lines back and forth across the search grid, effectively mowing the lawn to build a complete map of the ocean floor. In 1999, a Nauticos and U.S. Navy team worked the Midway seafloor by imaging sonar targets with a towed optical system. Close enough to capture stills and video of a sprawling debris field more than 17,000 feet down. Among the fragments were distinctive carrier features, including a landing light array associated with flight deck operations. The evidence said the carrier was nearby, but the main hull itself remained unconfirmed at the time, lost in darkness beyond what that expedition could definitively image. It would take 2 more decades for the search to close. On October 18, 2019, the team aboard the research vessel Petrel located and announced the main wreckage of Kaga in the deep waters near Midway. This time, the targets were not just fragments. The sonar returns and follow-on confirmation revealed a massive, distorted hull resting upright and embedded in sediment. It was the carrier's main body at last. The sonar image confirmed what the physics of the descent had suggested. The outline did not show the rectangular footprint of an aircraft carrier. It showed the narrower, tapered lines of a capital ship hull. The massive flight deck was not visible in the acoustic return. It was a ghost in the static, evidence that the ship had been stripped of her defining geometry. In September 2023, Ocean Exploration Trust returned with the exploration vessel Nautilus to conduct a non-invasive visual survey of Kaga. High-definition cameras and ROV operations verified what mapping had suggested and documented the wreck without contact. This confirmation matters because sonar can deceive. Rock can look like steel, and a ship half buried in silt can read like geology. The sensors had done their job. The Pacific collapsed into coordinates. When the ROV lights came on, the hull was there, upright, embedded, and ringed by scattered machinery. The sonar map had already hinted at it. Up close, it became undeniable. This debris field is not random. It is a mathematical graph of violence, written in distance and weight. The distribution of wreckage tells us how Kaga broke apart during her descent. This forensic analysis relies on the physics of debris field distribution. When a complex structure like an aircraft carrier disintegrates underwater, the pieces do not fall at the same speed. A heavy compact object like a gun barrel or an anchor chain has a high terminal velocity. It cuts through the water and falls almost vertically. A large flat object like a section of flight deck or a hangar bulkhead has a low terminal velocity. It acts like a hydrodynamic kite. It flutters and drifts in the current as it descends. By mapping the distance between the main hull and these lighter debris clusters, we can calculate the altitude at which the ship began to shed its skin. In the case of the Kaga, the wide dispersal of flight deck materials confirms that the upper works failed high in the water column. The hull raced to the bottom like a stone while the flight deck drifted and landed hundreds of yards away. This separation explains why the ship appears so clean on the sonar. The hydrodynamic drag stripped away the lighter components, leaving only the densest parts attached to the frame. When the remote vehicles moved in for a closer inspection, the truth of this sorting mechanism became undeniable. The objects that remain on the hull are the heavyweights of naval architecture. The massive anchor chains at the bow are still threaded through their hawse pipes. The capstans are intact. These are solid, dense iron components that refuse to let go even when the ship impacted the mud. The most striking example of this survival bias is found in the weaponry. Kaga carried Type 89 12.7 centimeter dual-purpose guns, heavy anti-aircraft mounts that also served as surface weapons. Today, the complex mount structures are damaged or scattered, but the barrels themselves tell a different story. During the survey, the camera zoomed in on one of these 5-inch guns lying on the deck. The mount is a wreck, but the barrel is pristine. High-definition footage captures sharp muzzle and bore detail, features that would be erased in shallower, more energetic water. The larger 20-centimeter, often described as 8-inch, casemate guns tell a similar story. Kaga carried 20 centimeter or 50 third-year type guns in casemate mountings along the hull, a legacy of early carrier doctrine and the ship's capital ship origins. On the seabed, some barrels remain visible even where surrounding structure is broken, buried, or draped in corrosion growth. This debris field creates a paradox for the survey team. The lighter evidence that would tell us about the fire damage on the flight deck is scattered and buried in the mud far from the hull. The heavy evidence that remains attached gives us a look at the structural bones of the ship, but not the operational spaces where the crew fought the fires. We can see the rifling in a gun barrel, but we cannot see the hangar deck where the bombs actually hit. Gathering this evidence required the remotely operated vehicles to hover inches away from jagged steel 3 miles down. This is an engineering tightrope walk. The debris provides the clues, but the environment imposes a strict limit on how much we can learn. The decision to observe these details without attempting to recover them is not just a matter of respect. It is a matter of hard technical constraints. The wreck of Kaga is protected by more than depth and darkness. The site lies within the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument, where access and activities are regulated through a permitting regime, and the wreck is treated as cultural heritage and a war grave. Under U.S. practice, sunken state vessels retain sovereign immunity after sinking, and unauthorized disturbance of sunken military craft, including foreign craft in U.S. waters, is prohibited. The operational boundary is clear: observe, document, and leave the site undisturbed. This constraint transforms the engineering challenge from a salvage operation into a high-stakes exercise in remote presence. The pilots flying the vehicles sit in a control room on the surface, miles above the target. They see through cameras and steer through a tether that runs thousands of meters down the water column. At these depths, precision is not only about the robot, it is about the entire coupled system: surface ship, tether, currents, and vehicle, holding station long enough to document jagged steel without contact. A small drift at the surface can translate into risk at the bottom, where one snag can end the dive. Under these conditions, the team successfully mapped the site without making contact. They documented the casemates where the secondary battery still points outward into the black. They illuminated the blast damage on the hull plating, but they left everything exactly where it lay. The only things allowed to touch the Kaga are the inhabitants of the deep itself. This brings us to a strange fringe detail observed in the sediment. On the few remaining flat sections of the deck, the cameras picked up distinct winding trails in the mud. These are the tracks of deep sea worms. Life exists even at this crushing depth. These organisms crawl over the grave of the Imperial Japanese Navy, indifferent to the history beneath them. They are the only visitors permitted to physically interact with the steel. The expedition achieved its objective. It was a non-invasive survey: locate, map, document, depart. The team identified the wreck, mapped the debris field, and characterized the hull without contact. And then the cameras found the detail that mattered most. At the very end of the ship, the hull does not taper to a point. It ends in a violent, jagged break. The hull of the Kaga ends before it should. At the stern of the vessel, the tapered steel lines that define a battleship-class hull come to a sudden, jagged halt. Roughly 40 feet of the ship is simply gone. This is the most violent structural scar visible on the entire wreck. The plating is peeled back, and the internal frames are crushed inward. It looks less like a structural failure and more like a physical amputation. This break confirms the historical accounts of the sinking. Witnesses reported that the Kaga went down by the stern. As the ship slipped beneath the waves, the stern section likely filled with water, first acting as a massive anchor. The rest of the ship was still buoyant and filled with air. The differential forces between the waterlogged stern and the buoyant midship section created a catastrophic bending moment. The keel snapped under the strain. The stern section tore away and spiraled to the bottom, independently, likely landing somewhere in the darkness outside the sonar grid. This damage is the final mechanism reveal of the survey. It proves that the ship did not die quietly. She was torn apart by the physics of her own sinking. The wreck that remains is a truncated monument to that violence. But amidst this massive industrial destruction, the most powerful evidence of the tragedy is not made of steel. It is made of leather. In the debris field mapped by the survey team, there lies a solitary object that changes the tone of the entire expedition. It is a boot. It is a standard issue Imperial Japanese Navy sea boot sitting upright in the mud. It has not rotted away. The tanning process used to cure the leather makes it resistant to the bacteria that consume organic matter. It sits there perfectly preserved while the steel ship around it dissolves. This small artifact serves as a permanent marker for the 811 men who were lost. It is the bridge between the cold engineering of the salvage survey and the human reality of the event. It is the reason why the mission was designed as a Path S survey with zero recovery. This brings us to the concept of war grave ethics. In maritime law, a sunken warship remains the sovereign territory of the nation that flagged it. It is immune from salvage and interference. But the ethical dimension goes deeper than the legal code. The Kaga is considered a mass grave. The decision to leave the site undisturbed is based on the principle that the wreck itself is the headstone. To cut into the hull or to recover artifacts for a museum would be an act of desecration. The modern approach to these sites is digital preservation rather than physical recovery. The high-resolution maps and the video footage captured by the remote vehicles serve as the artifact. We do not need to bring a gun barrel to the surface to study it. We do not need to retrieve the boot to understand the cost of the battle. By leaving these objects in place, we preserve the context of the loss. The boot belongs with the ship, and the ship belongs to the deep. The survey of the Kaga is a success because it respected this boundary. It answered the technical questions about the condition of the hull. It verified the destruction of the flight deck. It mapped the debris field. And it did all of this without leaving a scratch on the history. The team proved that we can see the past clearly without needing to own it. The Kaga remains on patrol at 17,700 feet. She is locked in the eternal darkness of the Pacific, protected by the crushing pressure and the silence of the monument. She is no longer a weapon of war. She is a permanent part of the ocean floor. The fires are out, the noise is gone. All that remains is the steel, the mud, and the silence.